Bullied for being fat, he became an all-American football player. His revenge shocked everyone. What would you do if everyone around you said you would never amount to anything? If they looked at you with disgust, laughed at your body, and mocked your dreams? Brandon Burlsworth heard this his entire life. They called him fat, clumsy, a nobody who would never make it in football. But he never gave up. Against all odds, he proved that determination can silence any insult. This is the story of a boy who turned humiliation into motivation, overcame bullying, and became one of the greatest college football players in history. But his story has an unexpected ending, a fate as shocking as his journey of perseverance. Stay until the end to discover how Brandon Burlsworth became a legend and why his legacy still lives on today. In 1989, in the small town of Harrison, Arkansas, a chubby boy named Brandon Burlsworth walked the halls of his middle school, keeping his head down, hoping, just hoping, that today would be different. But it never was. "Hey, fat boy, you gonna roll to class or waddle?" one kid sneered. Brandon clenched his fists but didn't say a word. He had learned that fighting back only made things worse. The insults, the laughter, the whispers behind his back, they were part of his daily life. At lunch, he sat alone. In gym class, he was always the last to be picked. And when he dared to mention his dream of playing football, the laughter grew louder. "Football? You?" The school quarterback chuckled. "You'd crush the field just by standing on it." Brandon felt the heat of shame rise to his face. He wanted to disappear. But at home, his mother Barbara saw something different in him. "Brandon," she said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "people will always have something to say, but God has a plan for you. You just have to believe." He nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure if he could believe in himself. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a question burned in his mind. What if they were right? What if he really wasn't meant to be anything more than a joke? Little did he know, his story was just beginning. Brandon had always loved football. Every Saturday, he sat glued to the TV, watching the Arkansas Razorbacks battle it out on the field. He didn't just watch the games, he studied them. He memorized plays, analyzed players' movements, and dreamed of one day wearing that red and white jersey. But dreams felt distant when reality constantly reminded him of his shortcomings. One afternoon, after another humiliating day at school, Brandon found himself staring at a flyer taped to the gym doors. Football tryouts this Saturday. His heart pounded. Could he really do it? Could he face the laughter, the judgment, the rejection? That night, he stood in front of the mirror, grabbing his belly with both hands. "They'll never take me seriously," he whispered. But then he heard his mother's voice in his head. "You just have to believe." So, against every doubt screaming in his mind, he showed up at the tryouts. From the moment he stepped onto the field, the ridicule began. "Burlsworth? Seriously?" One of the players scoffed. "Did you sign up for the team or the concession stand?" Brandon swallowed the insult and lined up for drills. The first few were brutal. His body was slower, less coordinated than the other kids, but he pushed through, refusing to quit. Then came his big chance. The coach called his name for a blocking drill. He had to hold his ground while another player tried to push past him. The whistle blew. Brandon planted his feet and braced for impact. Crack! The other player slammed into him, and before Brandon could react, he was flat on his back. Laughter exploded around him. Even the coach shook his head. "Son, if you want to play football, you'd better toughen up." Brandon lay there, staring up at the sky. His dream, his chance, had just turned into another humiliation. He could feel the familiar self-doubt creeping back in. Maybe he really wasn't cut out for this, but something deep inside him refused to let go. Instead of quitting, he made a silent promise. "I'll prove them all wrong." Brandon's failures on the field were hard enough, but at home, things weren't any easier. His father, Leo Burlsworth, was an alcoholic. Some nights he wouldn't come home at all. Other times he stumbled in, slurring his words, reeking of beer. "Football?" Leo scoffed one evening when Brandon mentioned his tryouts. "Boy, you ain't built for that. Maybe you should stick to something easier." Brandon lowered his gaze, biting his tongue. His older brother Marty wasn't as harsh, but he didn't exactly believe in Brandon either. "Look, man," Marty sighed, "I just don't want you to get your hopes up. This world isn't kind to guys like us." Their family was struggling. Money was always tight. His mother worked long hours just to keep food on the table. College? That was a luxury they couldn't afford to think about. Brandon knew that if he wanted a future in football, he'd have to carve his own path. One night, after another brutal practice where he was mocked and benched, Brandon sat alone on his bed. His hands were sore, his body ached, and doubt gnawed at his mind. Why keep going? Why fight so hard for something that felt impossible? Then he heard his mother's voice again. "God has a plan for you. You just have to believe." And for the first time, he made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to give up. If nobody believed in him, fine. He would believe in himself. Something changed in Brandon that night. He was done feeling sorry for himself, done listening to the doubters. If he wanted to play football, he would have to earn it. The next morning, while his teammates were still sleeping, Brandon was up before sunrise. He ran laps around his neighborhood, sweat pouring down his face. He lifted weights in his garage, using rusty old equipment Marty had left behind. At practice, he arrived first and left last. The coach started to notice. One day after practice, Coach Henderson, one of the assistants, pulled him aside. "You've got heart, kid," the coach said, "but heart ain't enough. You need to be stronger, faster, smarter." Brandon nodded. "Tell me what to do." Coach Henderson smirked. "All right then, let's see what you're made of." From that day on, Brandon trained harder than anyone else. While others took breaks, he did extra reps. While they laughed and joked around, he studied the playbook. He pushed himself past exhaustion, past pain, past every moment his body screamed at him to quit. And slowly, things started to change. He wasn't the slowest anymore, he wasn't the weakest. The same teammates who mocked him were now struggling to keep up with him. But just as he was starting to prove himself, a new challenge appeared, one that could end his football dream before it even started. By the time Brandon reached high school, he had transformed into a different player. He was stronger, more disciplined, and impossible to ignore. But when it came time for college scouts to choose their next recruits, Brandon's biggest obstacle wasn't his skill, it was his weight. "You're too big," one recruiter told him bluntly. "We need guys who are built like athletes, not offensive linemen from a buffet line." Rejection after rejection poured in. Every big-time college program, Alabama, Texas, Florida, passed on him without a second glance. It didn't matter how hard he worked. It didn't matter that he outtrained everyone. In their eyes, he still wasn't good enough. But then, an opportunity came, one that would require the biggest gamble of his life. The University of Arkansas was willing to give him a spot on the team as a walk-on. No scholarship, no guarantees. If he wanted to play, he would have to pay his own way, with no promise of ever stepping foot on the field. His family could barely afford rent. College tuition? Impossible. His brother Marty sat him down. "Brandon, be realistic," he said. "You've worked so hard, but you have real offers from smaller schools, schools that will pay for you to play. Why risk everything for Arkansas?" Because Arkansas was his dream. Brandon clenched his jaw and made his choice. He turned down every full-ride offer. He packed his bags, took out student loans, and walked onto the Razorbacks field with nothing but a dream and an unshakable will to prove himself. What he didn't know was that his hardest test was still ahead, and it would push him to the breaking point. Brandon stepped onto the University of Arkansas campus with nothing but his determination and a duffel bag of borrowed gear. He wasn't just an underdog, he was an afterthought. Walk-ons were treated like nobodies. They were glorified practice dummies, expected to take hits from scholarship players and never complain. But Brandon didn't care. He was finally where he wanted to be, and he was ready to do whatever it took to succeed. One day, a coach pulled him aside after practice. "You want to play at this level, son? You need size, real size. You're strong, but you need to get bigger." Brandon took those words to heart. For the next year, he ate relentlessly. He packed on pounds, 85 pounds to be exact. He thought he was doing what the coaches wanted. But there was one problem. He wasn't just getting bigger, he was getting slower. The extra weight slowed his footwork. His movements felt sluggish. He was worse than before, and his teammates noticed. "Hey, big guy," one of the star players mocked. "They said gain weight, not become a damn refrigerator." Brandon's stomach twisted. He had worked so hard to get here, but now he was nothing but a joke again. Coaches stopped paying attention to him. Teammates ordered him around like an assistant, making him run errands for them. His dream was slipping away, and for the first time in his life, Brandon felt like quitting. But just when it seemed like his football career was over, something inside him snapped. He had made one mistake, fine, but mistakes could be fixed, and he was about to show everyone just how wrong they were about him. Brandon sat in his dorm room, staring at himself in the mirror. The extra weight wasn't muscle, it was a burden, both physically and mentally. He had done what he thought the coaches wanted, but instead of getting better, he had become a joke again. But he refused to let this be his story. So, instead of quitting, he went back to square one. He changed his diet completely. No more overeating, no more excuses. Every meal was carefully planned for fuel, not just size. He trained harder than ever. While his teammates slept, he was in the weight room. While they partied, he was running drills alone in the dark. Every extra pound of useless fat was burned away and replaced with muscle, speed, and pure power. The same teammates who had laughed at him, now they watched in silence as he outworked every single one of them. Then, one day in practice, the moment of truth arrived. Brandon lined up against one of the team's top defensive linemen, a player who had bullied him since day one. This was it. The whistle blew. With explosive power, Brandon slammed into his opponent and drove him back 5 yards before planting him into the ground. Silence. The same players who had mocked him now stood in shock. The coaches took notice. Brandon Burlsworth wasn't a joke anymore, and soon he would prove it to the entire world. Brandon had spent years being the underdog, the punchline to every joke. But now they feared him. The once overweight walk-on had transformed into a beast on the field. His footwork was faster, his strength unmatched, his technique flawless, but he was still a walk-on. No scholarship, no guarantees. Then came the day that would change everything. It was a crucial practice session, one where players fought for their spot on the team. The coaches were watching. This was Brandon's moment. He was lined up against the team's best defensive lineman, a player who had been dominating opponents all season. Brandon could feel the eyes of his teammates, the coaches, the assistants. Some still expected him to fail. They were about to be proven very, very wrong. The whistle blew. Brandon exploded forward, hitting the defender with everything he had. The impact was like a car crash. The lineman tried to push back, but he couldn't move Brandon an inch. Then, with pure power, Brandon drove him backward. 5 yards. 10 yards. The defender's feet scrambled for grip, but it was useless. Finally, with one last surge of strength, Brandon slammed him into the ground. A stunned silence followed. Then, a voice broke through. "Holy hell, did you see that?" players whispered. Coaches exchanged glances. And then the head coach stepped forward. "Burlsworth," he said, his voice firm, "come to my office after practice." Brandon didn't know what to expect. Had he done something wrong? But when he entered the office, the coach was waiting, holding a scholarship contract. "You earned this," the coach said. Brandon's hands shook as he took the paper. It was real. The kid who was once laughed at, the walk-on who nobody believed in, had just earned a full-ride scholarship to play for the Arkansas Razorbacks. And he was just getting started. Brandon didn't just earn a scholarship, he earned respect. No longer a nobody, he became the heart of the Arkansas Razorbacks. Game after game, he dominated on the field, proving that his work ethic wasn't just talk. But what set him apart wasn't just his talent, it was his leadership. He never forgot what it was like to be overlooked, to be mocked, to be the underdog. So, when new walk-ons joined the team, players just like he had been, Brandon was the first to help them, and something incredible happened. 57 players walked on that year, inspired by Brandon's journey. If Brandon could do it, why not us? They thought. The Razorbacks, once considered underdogs, became a force to be reckoned with. With Brandon leading the charge, Arkansas had one of its best seasons in history. And then, the unthinkable happened. Brandon Burlsworth, the once overweight kid who was never supposed to make it, was named an All-American, one of the highest honors in college football. He had done the impossible, and the NFL had noticed. But just as his dream was becoming reality, life took a cruel, unexpected turn. Brandon's hard work had finally paid off. In 1999, he was drafted by the Indianapolis Colts in the 3rd round of the NFL draft. From a bullied, overweight kid to an NFL player, he had silenced every critic, proved every doubter wrong. His mother cried when she heard the news. His brother Marty, who had once questioned his decision, hugged him tighter than ever before. Brandon had made it, but he wasn't celebrating. Instead of partying, he did what he always did. He trained. The Colts saw him as a future star. He was set to sign his first big contract and play in the NFL that fall. But he never got the chance. 11 days after being drafted, tragedy struck. Brandon was driving home to Arkansas to take his mother to church. It was just another road trip, one he had taken countless times before. But on April 28, 1999, on a quiet highway in Arkansas, Brandon's car veered into oncoming traffic and collided with a tractor trailer. The impact was devastating. Brandon Burlsworth, just 22 years old, was gone. News of his death shocked the football world. Teammates, coaches, and fans couldn't believe it. How could someone who had fought so hard, who had defied the odds, be taken so soon? But Brandon's story didn't end there, because even in death, his legacy was just beginning. Brandon Burlsworth never played a single snap in the NFL, but his impact, it would last forever. His death shook the football world, but instead of fading into another tragic story, his name became a symbol of perseverance, faith, and the power of never giving up. The Indianapolis Colts honored him, leaving his locker untouched for the entire season. His teammates spoke about his work ethic, his kindness, and how he inspired everyone around him. But the biggest tribute came from his family and coaches. In his honor, they created the Brandon Burlsworth Foundation, dedicated to helping underprivileged kids chase their dreams, just like Brandon had. Each year, the Burlsworth Trophy is awarded to the best college football player who started as a walk-on. It's one of the most respected awards in the sport. And in 2016, his incredible journey was brought to life in the movie Greater, ensuring that future generations would hear his story. Brandon's dream didn't die with him. It lives on in every underdog who refuses to quit, in every kid who's told they're not good enough but fights anyway, and in every walk-on who steps onto the field believing that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. Brandon Burlsworth started as a nobody, but he left this world as a legend.